What's up, y'all? Back again today with a very important and revealing video. So today I wanted to come to you quickly and pose a question to you that kind of just popped in my head, and it really put a lot of stuff in perspective for me. Now, if you've seen a few of my videos, you might start to conclude that I might even be somewhat of a, a conspiracy theorist or something to that nature. I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist. I do feel that there were a number of conspiracies put in place, but that's another topic for another time. What I wanted to talk to you about is something in particular. And this question, I want you to really evaluate what I'm asking you. And then maybe from this question, you could start to really understand my perspective on America in general. Now, first, I want to say that, of course, I was born in this land that's called America. And so in many senses, you could call me an American. I'm proud of this land that I was born on. So in that sense, you could call me a proud American in some senses. But again, I want to ask you a particular question, and please understand why I'm taking my time with this, because this is actually a very powerful question. Okay? Now, we all know who the first president of the United States is supposed to be, right? So who's the first president of the United States? This guy, right? George Washington. Okay. So we know that. We know he was a president. What many of us also know, and some of us do not know, and many of us know but do not address, is the fact, the absolute scientific, undoubtable, unequivocal, unquestionable truth that George Washington, this man, on this dollar bill, George Washington owned slaves. When I say slaves, I mean plural. And I mean he did not win these slaves in a war. These slaves were in chattel slavery, meaning that they were in a perpetual state of servitude. So we have to understand the different levels of slavery before I tell you about my question. The different levels of slavery means that black people aren't the only people who've ever been enslaved. And I know this. And a number of not black people seem to tell me on my channel a lot, well, you know, black people weren't the only ones that were slaves. I've never said that. I've never said that black people were the only ones who were slaves. So moving forward, there are different levels of slavery. And in one of the most common forms of slavery is in war. Okay, servitude or indentured servitude. So this means that either if you've done a certain infraction or if you've been conquered in a war that you participated in knowingly, then you become a slave to that people. You as a person who was either conquered or you did some injustice, you as a person are subject to servitude. Now, there's different levels of servitude. As I said, there's different lengths of servitude. So you could be enslaved for a year. You could be enslaved for a day. You could be enslaved for a lifetime. But it only becomes a problem when it's a perpetual state of slavery for children who didn't do anything, who were just born into this family who are slaves for 400 plus years. So this is why there's a difference between the particular slavery that went on with black people. But moving forward to my question, I did say that I do have a question for you. So George Washington, now that we can do research and know for a fact that he owned slaves and he was our first American president, would we then say that someone like Donald Trump is not American? He's not traditionally American? Wouldn't we say that if the very first president and many of the presidents after that owned slaves, how can we say that Donald Trump being elected is regressing as far as what America stands for? Because again, if you think about what Donald Trump's slogan is, it's "Make America Great Again." And the word great is actually a subjective term. It's just based off of one's perception. Great doesn't necessarily mean progressive for all. Great doesn't necessarily mean equal for all or righteous for all. Great just is a word, a description that some people may use. So if Donald Trump says, make America great again, and we know in the inception of America, there were slaves that the president owned, we begin to see more clear what his language truly means. But still, I haven't asked you my question. This question is very powerful, so that's why I wanted to lead up to it. Now, if we know that George Washington owned slaves, plural, and if we know that on the same dollar bill that George Washington is on, we know on the back it says, "In God we trust," we can also come to the conclusion that possibly George Washington and others believed in Jesus, or not even Jesus, but just God. They say God, so let's just say God. In God we trust. But George Washington believes in God, and all these people believe in God that are spending this money, or it's at least on their money, so it was at least a powerful enough word for them to put on their money. But my question being, if George Washington believes in God, then in the Bible, it says, he who leads into servitude shall also be led into servitude. He who leads into captivity shall also be led into captivity. We know that servitude and captivity, particularly to capture someone, enslave them, is what George Washington did. So bear with me, because believe me, it's getting good. I'm setting this up for you to understand what my question really is. If George Washington, who believed in God and believed in the Bible, because we are officers are sworn in, presidents are sworn in on the Bible, if they believe in this scripture that they swear in on, and in that scripture it says, he who leads into captivity shall also be led into captivity, my question is, at what point did George Washington get led into captivity for having slaves? At what point was George Washington made into a slave for having slaves, as the scripture asserts? The scripture says that one who has slaves must become a slave. So if George Washington and many other presidents of the United States and many other people have had slaves, when have these people been enslaved? Furthermore, if they have not been enslaved in this lifetime, then there's two options. The first option would be that God's prophecy is not true, that the scriptures found in that Bible are not true. That's one option. The next option would be that, well, maybe they were enslaved in an afterlife, because an afterlife is mentioned in the scripture as well. So this is where many people would argue and say, well, the people who own slaves, well, maybe they're in slavery in the afterlife. But that's really an interesting topic, because then it brings you to the question that I initially wanted to ask you. Is George Washington in hell? Is George Washington a slave in hell right now? And I hope you can understand why I didn't open up with that question, because this is a sensitive topic, and many people might suffer from cognitive dissonance if they really listen to this. But based on the logic that I've laid out, and that George Washington laid out, and that the scripture laid out, it would suggest that George Washington and many other presidents and all the people who own slaves, that they are either in hell or that the scripture is not true. So, in conclusion, yes, my question is George Washington a slave in hell right now? Because if you believe in the scripture, as George Washington did, then it would mean that everyone who has owned a slave has to be a slave. So, in retrospect, after you answer that question, I would like you to answer the question below. Do you think George Washington is in hell, and is he a slave in hell right now? And then answer me why, because I don't want you to just say yes or no. This is a question that you really have to tell me why you think yes or no. And in retrospect, would that make us who worship this money and worship these people on this money who are in hell right now, possibly, would that make us be praising someone in a way that is in hell? Does that somehow implicate that we are connecting ourselves to someone who's suffering in hell right now? And furthermore, doesn't that mean that all of our forefathers, quote unquote, of this great nation that wrote the Declaration of Independence that had slaves, aren't they suffering in hell right now? I mean, if you believe in the God that's on the dollar bill, he said they're suffering in hell. They're slaves. They had to be, because we know that they weren't made slaves on this earth. Now, if they were made slaves on this earth, maybe then we could say, okay, they paid their due. But no, George Washington was never made a slave while he was alive. So, due to the scripture, he has to face captivity. This isn't my rule. This isn't my opinion. This is only my question. So with that being said, of course, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I need you to answer that question and think about that. Vibrate higher.